Thank you, Madam President. It's a bit of an unusual turn on a Thursday morning to have such raging bipartisan support in the way that we've seen during non-government business and private members' business this morning. And I think it's a great opportunity that has been brought to us by the Honourable Colin de Grisse and shortly the Honourable Pierre Yang to offer our condolences and respects to the significant loss of life and property during this fire season thus far. I know other parliaments have on their return in their opening sessions in 2020. Many of them have already conducted similar debates, condolence debates, or similar events within their parliaments. 2020 has been a particularly difficult fire season thus far, and some people have already outlined some of the really concerning statistics that have occurred. So some nearly 2,700 homes lost, some 33 deaths that have occurred. 4 of those were firefighters, an additional 3 were aviation firefighters, as members would be very aware of the large air tanker that crashed during the parliamentary recess. Some 1.25 billion wild animals killed, and 18.6 million hectares burnt were some of the statistics that I've seen published in recent weeks, largely from the significant events that have impacted the east coast of Australia. I think it's certainly the worst fire season we've seen since the Black Saturday fire in Victoria in February of 2009. And as I said, the fire season is still potentially some months from being over, particularly on the west coast. I think that we've all shared today a pride in the way in which our West Australian personnel, whether they be career employees or whether they be volunteers, have responded to the emergency events that have unfolded, whether they be fire, flood or cyclone or anything else that's impacted our good state and indeed our nation over the last few months. They have gone above and beyond, I think, in my view, and certainly we have seen a significant number of our personnel. I think the Minister just said 500 volunteers have been deployed interstate on operations. I think that's really important that we foster those interstate deployments. Some people perhaps have a view that we should keep our resources closer to home and on hand, ready to respond to what might unfold here. But I think that it's important for 2 reasons. I think that those volunteers that I know that have come back from interstate have really valued the experience, and I think in the realm of emergency response, experience is just as important as training. In fact, in some aspects, it's more important than formal training. And so I think that I haven't met a volunteer that's returned who has had, other than a very positive experience and a positive learning experience from serving interstate, and certainly have brought some ideas back to Western Australia and to our brigades, groups and units in terms of how we might do things better or perhaps differently. The other thing is obviously building and strengthening the relationship that we have with interstate agencies. And whilst this fire season may not be the one where we require interstate or international assistance, I'm sure there will be one that will come in the future where we rely on our cousins interstate or indeed internationally to help us out in a time of need. I think it's also important to note that the number of intrastate deployments is certainly, from my experience, increasing. We're seeing an increasing number of strike teams, increasing demand, particularly on volunteers to respond within the state of Western Australia. And this week we have a number of volunteer crews as well as career crews down in Katanning, assisting with the recovery of their community. And so members are aware, often those deployments are on a 1-5-1 model, so it's usually a day for travel at either end and 5 days of operations on the ground. So that's a significant commitment that gets made by both volunteers who get taken away from their everyday life, but also a lot of those career staff are being recalled from off-duty, perhaps on leave, to help bolster our capacity during these increased periods of activity. I wanted to talk a little about the impact of this fire season and some of the things that we need to continue to keep our focus on. And we've obviously had many debates, parliamentary questions, estimates, hearings, and all of the other occasions that the Parliament has used. And it's particularly in recent years, in my view, there's been an increasing focus on fire mitigation and specifically hazard reduction burning. And I think that's important. It certainly has been the criticism that in years gone by we've been far too response focused, and so now we need to become far more mitigation focused. How can we reduce those risks? And if you look at some of the key elements of emergency management, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, logistics, recovery and review. Now they used to be more simply prevention, preparedness, response and recovery, but obviously mitigation is one of those elements and response is one of those elements, but there are many other elements in terms of good and effective emergency management. I think we need to make sure that we don't place too much emphasis on any one of those things. And as I said, historically we've been criticised for being too response focused, and we're certainly lifting our game now on mitigation and good mitigation, targeted mitigation, because I think in years gone by we've been too focused on meeting arbitrary targets for mitigation, as opposed to perhaps being a bit more strategic around risk mitigation, and that might mean burning less hectares but more effective hectares. I want to make some observations about the Yanchep fire, which was obviously very close to my part of the world. It actually burnt into my local government area in the Shire of Gingin. That fire, interesting listening to an interview that the Incident Controller Superintendent Andy Winton did, and I'm sure those people who are watching that fire at the time, he made the observation, and it's quite often a strategy that's employed, that we have very good intelligence on fuel history, where we've done hazard reduction burns. All of that's plotted and mapped. So often fire managers will try and stop a fire or direct a fire into an area of low fuels. And that was certainly the case from what it appears at Yanchep. But interestingly, what happened there was that the fire behaviour did not significantly change as it burnt through an area of low fuel load. And I think that they were fuels of about 3 or 4 years post hazard reduction burning. Now that's not to say that hazard reduction burning isn't an effective mitigation tool. It's just that we're seeing increasing fire behaviour that is difficult, increasingly more difficult to control. So the point that I want to make on this is that mitigation isn't going to be the silver bullet, just like any of those other areas of emergency management principles will be the silver bullet. We must still make sure that we have an effective response capability. I think the greatest risk that we have, and I'm sure this applies right across Australia and indeed even internationally, is complacency. Complacency by communities, complacency by landholders, complacency by governments at all three levels, as well as legislators, to make sure that we have effective legislative frameworks in order to drive effective emergency management. If I can quote briefly, Madam President, from the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience in the foreword, which is penned by the National Emergency Management Committee co-chairs Roger Wilkins AO and Dr. Margot McCarthy. And they said this: application of a resilience-based approach is not solely the domain of emergency management agencies, rather it is a shared responsibility between governments, communities, businesses and individuals. And that's something that certainly was echoed by Mr Kilty, I think in his 2011 inquiry into the Perth Hills bushfire, which I think was actually entitled A Shared Responsibility. And so I think that one of the things as this fire season moves on, and perhaps we might go through a couple that are a bit quieter than this one, we as legislators and executive government and the community must make sure that the biggest risk, in my view, being complacency, doesn't set in, to make sure that our communities remain safe and resilient